Yes.
Fine.
So, good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to today's session of the PGIMAR PATH Alumni Global Education Endeavor Group session of lectures. And today we have with us Professor Reena Das, who will be talking about RBC membrane disorders and enzymopathies, a case-based approach. So I don't think that Professor Reena Das is any name which needs an introduction. Nevertheless, I take the privilege of introducing her. That currently she is a professor and head department of hematology at PGI Chandigarh, and she has a teaching experience of over 25 years, and her areas of interest are analyzing molecular genetics of non-malignant hematological disorders like thalassemia and hemoglobinopathies, uncommon hemolytic anemias, and inherited coagulation disorders. She has special interest in prevention of genetic hematological disorders as well as in evaluation of prenatal disorders. And she has received molecular training from Shenzhen, China, CMC Vellore, and Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine at Oxford, UK. She has more than 200 published papers and chapters in books. And over to you, ma'am. I'll not come between you and the audience.
Thank you so much, Ruchi. It's always a pleasure to hear your voice. And I just are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, perfectly fine. Please go
Yes,
ahead.
ma'am.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So I'll be talking about RBC membrane disorders and enzymopathies. And I took the planned it in such a way that it's a case-based approach because we actually learn hematology from our cases and the way we learn as days go by. And hematology never ceases to amaze me. And when we think that we probably know many things, a proper of a case will come, and then we won't be able to make the clinical diagnosis. So a brief take on the hemolytic anemias. This consists of a diverse group of disorders with wide clinical and molecular heterogeneity. The pathognomic finding is reduction in the level of circulating RBCs due to reduced red cell lifespan. Now, we have seen on many occasions, and I'll show you some examples, where actually the anemia is not there, though there is a reduction in the red cell lifespan. Now, how does the body manage? It is because many times we get compensated hemolysis with reticulocytosis. Now, there are many ways of classifying the hemolytic anemias. It could be a clinical classification of whether the presentation is acute or chronic hemolysis. It could be because of the pathologic etiology of whether it's immune or non-immune. The origin, whether it is intrinsically in the RBCs or because of an extrinsic factor to the RBCs causing the hemolysis. The site of the hemolysis, whether it's intravascular or extravascular, or whether it is acquired or an inherited condition. Today, I'll be talking mostly about the inherited hemolytic anemias. And the diagnosis actually requires a stepwise diagnostic algorithm to be followed. When we see hemolysis, it is due to increased destruction of RBCs. The clinical features are typically jaundice, cholelithiasis, splenomegaly, with or without anemia. When we do not get a good response to reticulocytes, that is the time when the bone marrow examination is actually required. And it is basically to exclude these conditions like sideroblastic anemias, congenital dyserythropoietic anemias, or pure red cell aplasias. Now, when we talk about the intrinsic disorders of RBCs, there are many disorders. The most common, of course, is the globin abnormalities, and we won't be covering them today. The red cell membrane disorders and the enzymopathies. Now, because we are going to talk mostly about the hemolytic anemias, appropriate reticulocyte response to anemia is due to the fact that each day approximately 1% of RBC pool is replaced by young RBCs released from the bone marrow. Now, there are these homeostatic mechanisms to accelerate erythropoiesis, and the bone marrow has the capacity of about 6 to 8 times the normal rate to respond to this anemia by releasing erythropoietin. Now, as a pathologist, we usually like to measure the adequacy of the erythropoietic response by the looking at the film, which is actually the manual reticulocyte count. But we know nowadays that the automated reticulocyte counts are very good. But usually we see that when there is an abnormal retic pattern, there is usually a flagging. So that the flagging just tells you by the counter that you need to have a look at the smear also. And we always like to have a look at the slide, whatever is if there is reticulocytosis, I feel happy to see the retic preparation. Now, inherited hemolytic disorders can be defined as defects in the erythrocyte membrane. The commonest, of course, is hereditary spherocytosis, but you can see that there are multiple disorders which are there, and many of them are pretty uncommon, and conditions like Southeast Asian ovalocytosis actually occurs in a very limited geographical location. We don't see very commonly hereditary elliptocytosis or hereditary pyropoikilocytosis, but off and on these rare disorders do crop up. Now, coming to the hereditary enzyme disorders, these are also known as non-spherocytic hemolytic anemia. Now, among the disorders of hexose, monophosphate shunt, and glutathione metabolism, the commonest, of course, is G6PD deficiency. And we get a lot of cases, in the Punjab region also, it's fairly not uncommon, I will say. And many cases actually present with neonatal jaundice. Coming to the disorders of glycolysis, is the pyruvate kinase deficiency, which is the second commonest, and uncommon disorders like hexokinase deficiency or glucose phosphate isomerase deficiencies can take place. And these are always difficult to identify because there are very few laboratories which actually can define these enzyme deficiencies. Even pyruvate kinase deficiency is a diagnostic problem because when we are examining the blood, the pyruvate kinase levels in the RBCs are not that much as in the leukocytes. So we know the RBCs are so much more in numbers, but when it comes to leukocytes, the activity is much higher. And that is the reason why we need to deplete the blood leukocytes before we can actually put up the assay. So these are very complicated kind of analysis which need to be done. Coming to the disorders of erythrocyte nucleotide metabolism, pyrimidine 5' nucleotidase deficiency is supposed to be the third commonest. However, these are also pretty uncommon, and I haven't really seen any case till now, but there are some reports from India. Professor Tejinder Singh has some publications, and off and on people have reported this deficiency. Now, what are the genes which are there, which are associated with hemolytic anemia or dyserythropoietic anemia? Now, this is just giving us an idea about, the number of genes which are there. Now, majority till here are, till the PGD is actually the genes which are with hemolytic anemias. And then there are some which are associated with dyserythropoietic anemias. But the numbers which are, this is telling you the transcript size in base pairs, and you can see that the transcripts are of variable sizes. Now, the numbers which are given at the top are actually the number of exons which are there. And even that you can see is so complicated that something like ankyrin 1, it has 48 exons. So it's extremely difficult to do genetic analysis based on Sanger sequencing. It is not just because of the numbers, it becomes very expensive also to do Sanger sequencing for getting to a specific diagnosis. So coming to the laboratory investigations for the hemoglobinopathies, the best investigation, of course, is the hemoglobin HPLC. When we see an abnormal peak, we end up doing an electrophoresis at alkaline pH. And if we are suspecting HBH disease or alpha thalassemias, when there are 3 gene deletions, at that time the HBH inclusions can be tested for on the peripheral smear, which is actually just an extension of a reticulocyte count analysis. We incubate it for a longer time and see the smear and see the typical golf ball appearance. The unstable hemoglobins are a little difficult to diagnose because though you see reticulocytosis, you need to do the specific tests like the heat stability test. And for the hemoglobinopathies, either we do the ARMS PCR, or for the alpha thalassemias, we do the multiplex gap PCRs. And then if we don't really find the mutations, we can look at this specific beta globin gene sequencing or the alpha globin gene sequencing. For the red cell membrane disorders, typically we are able to see these RPCs with spherocytes, and then you can get some mushroom cells, you can get acanthocytes in certain disorders, even in spherocytosis. Now, very typically, we do the incubated osmotic fragility test. And this is a time-tested kind of a test, which is a good test for spherocytosis. It's not specific for hereditary spherocytosis. When you want to diagnose that, it's a good idea to check the parents as well when you're doing the incubated osmotic fragility test. Usually with spherocytosis, we need to do the direct Coombs test to exclude autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Flow cytometric eosin 5-maleimide dye binding test is a good test if you have a flow cytometric instrument. And nowadays, we have started doing the flow cytometric osmotic fragility test. Even this is pretty sensitive for hereditary spherocytosis. The problem areas are these enzymopathies, because enzymopathies can give rise to a false negative kind of a result when you're doing the testing. Now, this is a smear where you are seeing these hemis ghosts kind of, spherocytic. If you don't really see them very carefully, they look like spherocytes, but you can see that the hemoglobin actually has come to one side and there is a clear space here. So these are the Burr cells and the ghost cells. And you can do the Heinz body test. We do the hemoglobin reduction test, but there are many quantitative assays which give you the exact values. You can do the fluorescence spot test, which is a good test if you have to do it in a field setting or you want to transport the samples after blotting. The pyruvate kinase activity is a little difficult to do, and there is a fluorescence spot test as well. But then again, you have to do the test only after leukodepleting the sample. So for hereditary spherocytosis, it's a very typical presentation, which is again a kind of non-specific presentation for all hereditary hemolytic anemias. Usual presentation is like jaundice and splenomegaly, gallstones of the pigmented type are there, and on the smear, we'll be able to see specific spherocytes, which are there, microspherocytes. Now, when we look at the family studies, in an autosomal dominant kind of inheritance pattern, we'll be able to see where it's like a vertical kind of inheritance that we see here. Now, majority of the cases of hereditary spherocytosis are because of autosomal dominant inheritance, or they happen as a sporadic case, and then the inheritance is autosomal dominant subsequently. In disorders where the alpha spectrin is involved, most of the times the patients present more with more severe anemia. Usually it is an autosomal recessive kind of an inheritance. So you could get any kind of inheritance with hereditary spherocytosis. You could get a family history when it helps you. If you don't have a family history, then it could be a problem diagnosis. So usually a typical case, there is no problem to identify the defect. And this is just a diagrammatic representation of the red cell membrane, the bilipid layer over here. And we have the band 3, which is the most prominent or the maximum amount of the red cell membrane protein, which is there. The ankyrin, which kind of binds the 4.2, comes in between the band 3 and the ankyrin. And the ankyrin is anchors onto the beta spectrin, and the beta spectrin is intertwined with the alpha spectrin. So this is actually the horizontal interaction which is there, and this part is the vertical interaction. And these are the 5 proteins which are associated with hereditary spherocytosis in most instances. Now, this particular test, the eosin 5-maleimide binding test, by flow cytometry is a very specific test. However, it can be positive or it can show reduced values. The mean channel fluorescence ratio will be reduced in hereditary spherocytosis, as well as some cases of type 2 CDA and some other hemolytic anemias, but they are not very common. So the only catch about this test is that whenever we do the test, at every time, we must take 5 to 6 normal control samples of roughly the same age, sex ratio, if possible. But this is required because there is a day-to-day variation in the amount of fluorescence that we see. So typically what we have to do is that we gate these red cells and look at the mean channel fluorescence. Now, this is just to show you that after we have done those 5-6 controls, we take the mean value of the controls. And so in this given case, we have the value of 4040. And in the patient with hereditary spherocytosis, we have seen a value of 2890. When you look at the just the graph, you won't be able to really make out very much, but this value itself is important. The MCF is important. And here, it is 0.71, and in our lab the setting is that usually it is less than 0.8%, is quite consistent with the diagnosis with HS in an appropriate clinical setting. So we found that there was no overlap in the MCF ratio, and the percentage decrease of MCF between different types of anemias is much less compared to HS. Now, these parameters are very sensitive and specific, and we found that even after a splenectomy, that if this test is done, it still shows you the reduced values even when the hemoglobin has come back to normal. So it's a specific kind of a test. Now, if you want to know the type of mutation which is there, we now go on to next generation sequencing. Usually we do a targeted next generation sequencing, and this is just a general workflow which is given over here. We like to use the MiSeq equipment which is there and sequencing method. And again, I would just like to say that mostly for the diagnosis of HS, molecular diagnosis is not really required unless it's a difficult diagnosis because of any reason which could be there. Many times if it is severe enough, then the patients actually require transfusions, and then there could be a diagnostic problem. And if there is no positive family history, again, it could be a diagnostic difficulty. This is just telling you something about the bioinformatic filtering pipeline which is there, but I'll show you some examples to see how we actually look at the bioinformatic part. So after we have found missense type of variants, these variants are the most difficult to give pathogenicity, and that's why there are many softwares, and these are predominantly all freely available softwares which are there, which have been developed, and you can get it on the net. The only thing which is required is to be using them frequently, so that you know that what is the implication of the scores which are there. And I'll again show you a few examples of these. So we had found just a couple of examples to show that this was a novel missense heterozygous mutation or a pathogenic variant which was found in band 3 in exon 16. It looks heterozygous over here. Typically, the peaks are overlapping between a T and a G. The T is a red in color and G is depicted as black in color. Now, this was a patient who had a late presentation with anemia jaundice. Hemoglobin is moderate, 8.8 grams %, and reticulocyte count was increased, required some transfusions. There was no splenectomy history in this patient till then, and there was an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. So very typical kind of a case. And this is just to show you that this is how the Polyphen 2 looks like. This is a software which will give you a kind of score. So here the score is 1. So if you get this black line towards the green side, it shows that this is a benign kind of a variant which is there. The more it is towards the red side, it tells you that this is a most likely a pathogenic variant. So this is just a bioinformatic tool to give you an idea. Now, when we are looking at the polyphen 2, there is another part which can be looked at, and this is just to show that this particular amino acid, the L over here, which is actually this particular position, 677, this is kind of conserved over the various species. So these are the different types of species which are there, and this is known as multiple sequence alignment, which tells you that this particular amino acid is possibly important because it has been conserved over multiple different types of species. So that's the only kind of idea you get from that multiple sequence alignment. This is another case of hereditary spherocytosis. This was kind of interesting because when we looked at the proband, here we found a heterozygous variant in the DNA. And when we looked at the reverse transcripted PCR product from the complementary DNA after doing an RNA extraction from the reticulocytes, we found that in this particular patient, there was a band which was an additional band which was there. So it showed as if that there is some kind of deletion has taken place. And this was actually the position where the deletion happened because this was a splice site variant. And the splicing, this particular site, the GT is the position of the donor variant which was there. And what had actually happened was that there was a exon skipping of the entire exon 4, which was consisting of 99 base pair. So when we did the cDNA sequencing, immediately after exon 3, there was this exon 5, which is kind of just shown in this diagrammatic representation of an aberrant pattern of splicing which has happened here, where the exon 4 is completely missing. So what we found in our analysis, this work was done by Dr. Anu Agarwal. This was a PhD work where she looked at a lot of cases of hereditary spherocytosis. And in our population, we found that majority of the defective genes were in the ankyrin 1 and followed by the beta spectrin. From the West, there are studies which have shown that the variants in the band 3 were more compared to our study kind of. We got only 4% and majority were covered between these two, ANK1 and the beta spectrin. This was the publication which was the work of Anu, and this was published in British Journal of Hematology. So coming to a case history, this was a patient who was 26 years male. He came with the only complaint of jaundice, and his problem was that he was about to get married, and he says that I have this jaundice for so many years and I don't want to, my wife shouldn't be complaining that my husband has this jaundice. So if you can get a diagnosis actually. So when we look at the hemoglobin was just 12.3 grams, so he was fine. But looking at the smear, we found that there were these stomatocytes which were there. And very amazing was the reticulocyte response which was there. Very high reticulocyte, it was about 25.6%, which was corrected reticulocyte, and the presence of multiple stomatocytes in this particular case. There was no family history in the entire family. When we did the scanning electron microscope, just as an interest, we saw these cup-shaped kind of RBCs, which looked very nice actually for the image. So there was compensated hemolysis, parents and siblings were normal, and the EMA flow cytometry was normal. So it was taken up for targeted next generation sequencing. And then after doing the annotations, we found that there were so many variants which were detected. And this is typically what happens when you get results of next generation sequencing. So you need to do some bioinformatic kind of analysis by which you remove the synonymous variants, so that the ones which don't change the amino acids, they can be removed. And these various normal kind of databases are there. Those particular variants are again removed. The ones which are predicted to be deleterious, Those are the ones which are important for us. And then because we knew the clinical history that there was hemolytic anemia in this particular patient, so we ended up with 3 variants which were there. Now, looking at the family history, it seemed like that we are dealing with an autosomal dominant kind of a pattern which is there, and we ended up with these 3 variants which are there, in the RAC gene and the ANK1 gene. They were all missense mutations, and they appeared to be deleterious. So what did we do finally? So we looked at the bioinformatic tools. This is another bioinformatic tool which tells that this variant is deleterious in exon 28 of ANK1. So we did the sequencing, and in the Sanger sequencing, we found that it was heterozygous, and then we found that the father was also heterozygous. But since the father was asymptomatic, we thought that this mutation cannot be the pathogenic variant. So then we looked at the other 2 variants which were there, and we found that there was one, the RAX gene exon 7 variant. This was deleterious in a lot of tools, and there was this variant in exon 3 which appeared to be neutral. So we did the Sangers for the next one, which again we found that it was heterozygous in the case, and the mother also had it, and since she was asymptomatic, we thought that this is not pathogenic. So then we tested again the 3rd variant which was there, and we found that the 3rd variant was there in the patient but missing in the parents. And since this is the only one which was there in the case, so we thought that this is the variant which is actually important for this particular case. So this kind of analysis, where we are taking the help of the family, becomes very important, and it helps us to kind of tell that which particular variant is probably pathogenic in this in a particular given case. But it really is looking at it's like finding a needle in the haystack actually when you're looking at the variants. This particular one, we looked at the restriction enzyme site and found that this variant was missing in our normal population, and then while reading we found that next to the RAC protein, actually, we have the CD47. So we tried the flow cytometry. We got the antibody and tried flow cytometry in this particular patient, and we found that the normal control, the mean channel fluorescence was about 1,311, and in the patient with stomatocytosis, it was only 705. So it was approximately 50%, and this kind of helped us to do the functional validation that this is the variant which is important in this given case. And then, so this was actually the first case of overhydrated stomatocytosis, which was associated with the complex RAG genotype. Which we diagnosed in our center, and this was published. So coming to another case, this was a 17 years male from a non-consanguineous marriage and was diagnosed as hereditary spherocytosis at the age of 8 years and was on intermittent follow-up. The sister also gave features of chronic hemolysis with jaundice and spherocytes and reticulocytosis. The incubated osmotic fragility test was positive in the index case and the sister. And both the brother and the sister had multiple follow-up visits to the pediatric hematology clinic and the pediatric gastroenterology clinic also. The sister was also being evaluated for Turner syndrome with streak ovaries. So at this present time evaluation, the patient was, the index case was referred to us for a EMA test because we had just about started doing the flow cytometry. And when we looked at the peripheral smear, I was expecting spherocytes to be there, but what we found was that there were a lot of stomatocytes. And you can see that in this particular case, there are so many stomatocytes which are there. And in addition, we found a lot of these giant platelets. So there was some thrombocytopenia which was there, giant platelets, some reticulocytosis. And this is the peripheral smear of the sister. Here again, you can see that giant platelets are there. And this is the platelet histogram showing the giant platelets which we found in this case. So at that particular time, we did not know the existence of this condition. So we did a Google search. So we said, let's look for stomatocytes and let's look for giant platelets or macrothrombocytopenia. Because when we looked at this, the follow-up of this particular family, we found that in the index case, the anemia was not really significant, but the thrombocytopenia was very significant because the giant platelets were being missed by the counter, which was by the impedance-based counter. The reticulocyte count was slightly towards the higher side, and there were these spheros and stomatos and all. Because of the thrombocytopenia, the bone marrow had been done in 2011, and it was called as megakaryocytic thrombocytopenia. So this is the result of what we got on the Google search. We said stomatocytic hemolysis and macrothrombocytopenia is the hematological presentation of cytosterolemia. What is this? This is the clinical manifestation in the family, raised the suspicion of a syndromic stomatocytosis. So the implicated genes are ABCG5 and ABCG6, which ABCG8. These are on chromosome 2. And we found the variant which was there in ABCG5 as a homozygous variant. This was a stop gained which was there, and this was a cause of cytosterolemia. What is cytosterolemia? This is the IGV, how it looks like. This was like the homozygous variant which was there in this particular case on the reverse strand. Now, Sankar sequencing of the index case showed this case to be homozygous, and the sister and the brother, they were also affected. The brother had not been investigated till then, and we found the parents to be heterozygous. So basically, the validation was done in this family. So we also ended up doing the haplotypic analysis, and we found that all the 3 siblings had identical haplotype, which was, I think, 13 sites or 14 SNPs which were there. And this haplotype showed that this particular variant mutation was very specific to our population, was different from the Caucasian cohort which was there. So phytosterolemia is a rare recessively inherited metabolic condition in which the absorption of sterols, including cholesterol and plant-derived phytosterols, is unselective and uncontrolled. And it should be considered as a diagnosis in any patient with unexplained hemolysis and or microthrombocytopenia. So usually these patients, we need to tell them that their diet should be reduced of these plant-derived phytosterols, or and usually we tell them that, you know, better to take ghee kind of a thing rather than vegetable oils. Xanthomas can be associated with premature cardiac death. And the good thing is that there is a drug which is fairly cheap, actually, ezetimibe, which has been approved by FDA for these patients because this is a cholesterol absorption inhibitor. So there is a scope of treatment which can be offered for this. Since we have diagnosed this case, we have actually come across many patients with this condition. So it's just that, you know, we've started identifying cases, and whenever we see hemolytic anemia, we specifically look for giant platelets if it is there or in the case. So it was kind of a learning experience. This is a case history of the case who was a 6 months old Bengali child, was presented with progressive pallor and mild jaundice for 2 months. She was born to a second gravid mother, non-consanguineous marriage, had severe neonatal hyperbilirubinemia on day 1 of life. Bilirubin was really high, and there was a double volume exchange which had to be given. So when this case came to us, at that time, we saw a lot of these acanthocytes, some spherocytes, and there was reticulocytosis, which was significant. The corrected retic was about 39%. So the child, all kinds of investigations were done, and we had thought that maybe because it's so severe, the PKLR gene sequencing should be done. But on NGS, we found that this was a homozygous variant, which was there in GPI, which is the glucose phosphate isomerase gene. And this was already associated with the hemolytic anemia of the non-spherocytic variant. Now, this was again damaging kind of by polyphen 2. And when we looked at the parents, again, we found that the parents were heterozygous for the variant which was there. Now, this particular case was also the first time that we diagnosed a GPI variant in our families. And this is a very specific position, because this position, there is an arginine. If it becomes a histidine, this is involved with the dimerization site, and this mutation will lead to a loss of the H bonds and give rise to a very severe kind of a variant. Another case history, this was again very interesting, because this case was diagnosed as a case of hereditary hemochromatosis in 1992. And the final diagnosis actually came just last year, or maybe last to last year, when the patient had come on follow-up. Now, liver biopsy had been done at that time, and the liver biopsy was suggestive of hereditary hemochromatosis. The serum ferritin was high on various multiple occasions, and the patient was on regular phlebotomies. So the patient, because there was jaundice for so many years, and the phlebotomies, there was kind of generalized weakness which was there. The patient was quite hyperpigmented, and there was splenomegaly. Now, around in the year, I think roughly about 15 years back, we had done the DNA analysis for hemojuvelin, the HFE, and the common variants were missing in this case. So at this particular time, when I looked at the hemoglobin, I found that the hemoglobin has gone down, and we thought that maybe because multiple phlebotomies has given rise to the anemia. But at this time, the reticulocyte count was high. There were a lot of these nucleated RBCs. And then when we looked very carefully, this is not a very nice smear, but we could see some stomatocytes which were there, and kind of these cup-shaped kind of RBCs which were there. So this looked a bit odd for a diagnosis of hereditary hemochromatosis. And when we did the targeted NGS, we actually found a missense variant in the piezo gene. Now this piezo gene, and along with this, we also found the UGT1A1 variant which was there. And this variant is also associated with increased jaundice that this particular patient had. And then we found this particular mutation, which was in the piezo gene. Now, when we did the validation by Sangers, we found that this is heterozygous at this position, and this was already reported to be a cause for dehydrated hereditary stomatocytosis with or without pseudohyperkalemia, and some patients have been reported to have perinatal edema also. So hereditary xerocytosis usually have compensated hemolysis. There's no requirement of blood transfusion, and the dehydrated stomatocytosis is one of the conditions which can give rise to heavy iron loading condition. And that is what had happened in this particular case. And because of the investigations and the way it went to the liver clinic and was diagnosed as hereditary hemochromatosis, which actually masqueraded the diagnosis of hereditary xerocytosis. So sometimes, we don't look at the smear very well, and we can get into trouble like this. So any cause of anemia will actually give rise to increased absorption of iron from the gut, and can give rise to secondary hemochromatosis. And that is something we need to keep in mind, that there are reports in the literature of misdiagnosis of cases with hemolytic anemia, which ended up being called as hereditary hemochromatosis. And this was one such case. So inherited stomatocytic disorders can be multiple kind of causes which are there, multiple genes which are involved, and even different types of inheritance pattern. And we just have to keep an eye on what are the kind of associations which may be there, which can give rise to these conditions. This is another case. This was a young boy from Jammu who was referred because of neonatal jaundice, and the mother was hypothyroid. Antenatal period was fine. The mother's blood group was O positive, and so was the child. The child required multiple transfusions, and there was a red maculopapular rash which was there. And when we looked at the hemoglobin, it was consistently, it was severe anemia. And the reticulocyte count and mature reticulocyte fraction was suppressed. So it can actually be suppressed even when the patient keeps on receiving multiple transfusions, which can actually give rise to the bone marrow being, shut off for a while. And if we happen to do the reticulocyte count at that time, you can get a wrong or a reduced reticulocyte response. So, because the retic response was not there, we did the bone marrow, and in the bone marrow, we did find a few this erythropoietic kind of RBCs which were there. So, and there was some megaloblastosis also. The nucleated RBCs were there in the peripheral blood, but nothing very specific could be seen. And that usually happens when the child receives multiple transfusions. We don't really see too many specific changes. So, in this particular case, we found actually the pyruvate kinase gene to be involved, and so this is the index case where the two different variants were there. So it was a compound heterozygosity kind of case, and because this patient was diagnosed, the affected his sister was also sequenced and diagnosed for hereditary pyruvate kinase deficiency. So, so this was a kind of wrong diagnosis which was there. I'll come to the next case, which is a case where this child was presented with very severe hemolytic kind of a picture. The patient was 10 months when he came to us, and there was neonatal jaundice. On the peripheral smear, we found these, these RBCs which are looking polychromatophilic. This is a Cabo ring which is there. Some nucleated RBCs showing some dyserythropoietic kind of features. Some basophilic stippling was also noted. And the regular things were looked at. There was severe hemolysis in this case, no positive family history. So we did the whole exome sequencing in this case because there was no causal variant that we found by targeted resequencing. And because of that, we had to take help from Dr. Arindam Mehta at National Institute of Biomedical Genomics. They have actually helped us with all the sequencing by targeted NGS that we did. So in this particular case, they did the whole exome sequencing for us. And there was this mutation which was there in hexokinase 1 gene. Now, this hexokinase 1 gene is very few cases are there in the literature. And in this family, we found that this was a homozygous kind of event which was there. There was already an RSID, means it was already reported kind of a variant which was there. We found that we could do a PCR RFLP to identify the variant, because here in this particular case, we needed to do the prenatal testing for the family. So very rapidly, this was done for the family. So about this particular variant, the hexokinase 1 actually has multiple isoforms which are there. And this is just to show that sometimes, you can end up missing some of the variants, because our idea was that what was the reason, why did we miss the variant when we did the targeted NGS, and we got the mutation actually in the exome sequencing. So when we studied this further, we found that there are various isoforms of this hexokinase, and the isoform which is the R variant is very specific for the RBCs, and there's an alternate promoter which is important to identify the various kind of isoforms. So we found that the variant which was actually there happened to be the canonical variant was actually at the position which was like the intronic variant it was shown as, and this position was deep inside the intron. So when we looked at the data of the targeted NGS, at that time we kind of missed this variant because we did not think it to be pathogenic. But when we looked at the isoform, the isoform which is important for the RBCs, we found that this is a pathogenic variant in this particular case. Now, the good thing is that this particular variant actually is amenable for prenatal testing, which we did in this family. But because this was a learning exercise for us, we actually published this as a problem case, of misdiagnosis because you are not aligning it to the correct isoform. And if it is not the specific one, then you can do a misdiagnosis even after you have done a targeted next generation sequencing. And now we find that these various softwares which are there will be able to tell us, because the isoforms now are much more what is that called, they have been curated much better than before. So currently the isoforms which are there, only 2 of them have been shown. But if you see the previous ensemble database, it showed multiple variants which were important actually. So there are certain limitations of next generation sequencing, and one of the thing is that occasionally, the variants can be in the non-coding region or promoter region or enhancer regions, or it could be a deletion which may be much larger and you may not be able to pick up by the next generation sequencing. So there are therapeutic implications which are there. A correct diagnosis in cases of overhydrated hereditary stomatocytosis tells us that you should not do a splenectomy, because in the patients with OHS, splenectomy can give rise to thromboembolism. And in cases of Mediterranean stomatocytosis with macrothrombocytopenia, these patients could be started on the drug, which is a fairly cheap drug. We have diagnosed occasionally cases of MTRR deficiency, which identified cases with SEC23B mutation where prenatal testing can be done. Also, now there is a trial which is going on, which is for pyruvate kinase deficiency, where this particular enzyme activator, AG348, can give rise to sustained increase in the level of hemoglobin. So many cases actually the molecular diagnosis helps us, and in some cases actually it is just for interest that we have done, like the hereditary stomatocytosis. The take-home message by showing all these cases to you is that hemolytic anemia diagnosis requires a stepwise diagnostic algorithm to be followed. The clinical manifestations are jaundice, cholelithiasis, splenomegaly. The phenotypes can vary from having fully compensated hemolysis, which can be without anemia, to severe transfusion-dependent hemolytic anemia. The causal genes implicated in congenital hemolytic anemias are numerous, making a gene-by-gene approach time-consuming, expensive, and labor-intensive. And use of targeted resequencing can expedite the molecular diagnosis, where the cause for hemolysis remains unexplained after routine lab tests. Family studies are extremely important to prove pathogenesis, which I've highlighted in this particular presentation. So I would like to acknowledge that all this work would not have been possible without the cooperation of the Pediatric Hemato-Oncology Unit and the Adult Clinical Hematology Unit. The major work has been done by Dr. Manu Jamwal and Dr. Anu Agarwal. They have done a PhD with me. A lot of the work and the initial, all the targeted NGS work was the entire hand-holding was done by Dr. Arindam Maitra and Professor Partha Mazumdar from NIBMG Kalyani. I'm grateful to my faculty colleagues, our DM hematology students, who always remain inquisitive to keep on asking questions. And of course, we have an excellent technical staff of our department and the institute who have helped us to do all these investigations, which I could showcase to you today. And I would just like to say that I've just shown you some examples of cases which we have solved. There always remains so many cases where we don't come to a specific diagnosis in many cases actually. And I would like to end by asking if there are any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. That was an excellent talk, and you so comprehensively dealt with so many different, disorders. And I'm sure half of us might not, we might have come across these cases and not really reached the final diagnosis, and they are still this big question mark for us. So I am not sure if we have any questions in the chat box. Dr. Nadeem, can you help if I'm missing something over here?
There are no questions right now in the YouTube except for a comment. And if anybody here on the meet would like to unmute and ask a question.
Ma'am, in the meanwhile, people are putting in their questions. Please pardon my ignorance about NGS. But ma'am, when we talk about, when you're saying targeted sequencing, so like how do you decide what, how do you narrow down to that particular gene that eventually you reach that this is what was the defect? Like if I ask you, you saw stomatocytes, so is it like a panel of genes in that? Is it like a panel like we have in myeloid malignancies or something, or how do we go about it?
Yeah, so initially, we had done some cases where we did a non-specific kind of a sequencing, where it was all pathogenic variants to be found out, any disease kind of a situation, the true site panel. That is quite expensive, and it is not kind of cost effective to do that kind of a thing. So what Manu had done was that she looked at the literature and whichever genes were implicated with hemolytic anemia. So it's basically the panel was made after doing just the literature search, and based on that, she actually made the created the panel, you can say. And out of that, roughly, I think almost 35 genes are were implicated, and it is possible to narrow down depending on, if you see like spherocytes, then you look at the ANC1 and the beta spectrin, alpha spectrin, that kind of a situation. If you see stomatocytes, then you have to look for that specific thing. Now these enzyme problems are always a difficulty which is there, because you're not able to pick them up kind of. So they always remain a difficulty, and NGS actually helps us, because especially if the child has received transfusions or the adult has received multiple transfusions and we are not able to pinpoint any morphological feature, it happens quite not very infrequently that we really don't see anything very
frequent.
Yeah. So in those situations, I think what we do is, if we see reticulocytosis, can't make out anything, just keep it for NGS. That's what we have been following, and that has led us to all these various different types of mutations which have been there actually. I can see Dr. Prashant there.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, Dinesh.
Actually, I'm not finding any option for chat to write. So
Okay.
Can I ask ma'am one question?
Please do. Yeah.
First, ma'am, thank you for such a wonderful talk. Ma'am, my question is, as most of the places flow cytometry and molecular workup are not available, so for the hereditary sclerocytosis, which test is better, whether it is conventional or incubated OFT, or it is cryohemolysis test? So sensitivity and specificity wise.
Yeah, we haven't ever done actually the cryohemolysis, and I've seen the literature that it's a very good test actually. So we haven't done, somehow it's just maybe the center wise or something like that. We just do the incubated osmotic fragility test, and because the flow is there with us, we end up doing the EMA flow cytometry. But I have heard that it's a very good test. I've seen some publications. It's just that we haven't done it. I don't know if you have any experience to share with us.
No, ma'am. Actually, we are also not doing that. We are also doing the flow cytometry at EMA. But recently, I was reviewing a paper on hereditary spherocytosis. So they did the clinical history and cryohemolysis, and they have also compared with the other tests. So they said in their paper, the result was showing that it has very good sensitivity and specificity for the detecting hereditary spherocytosis. So that's why I just want to know, okay, those centers who don't have these facilities in their place, can they go with a clinical history and all those things? So if they have to choose between OFT conventional type, which we do by making serial consultation, or we should choose a cryohemolysis test.
So, because I don't know about cryohemolysis, I'm not saying about that, but don't do osmotic fragility by itself. always do the incubated osmotic fragility test, because that's the recommendation at the moment. So earlier we used to do just the osmotic fragility. If that would come negative, then we would do the incubated. But now it is advised that straight away just do the incubated OFT.
Thank you.
For typical cases, I think the British Society says that you can, if you are seeing spherocytes and you have a typical clinical presentation, and you can, document increased fragility. So that is it. I don't think he is more. But as you have pointed out, there are so many cases when this is not helping. So there we'll probably need to go down to these molecules. So ma'am, back to being a student. So ma'am, if I ask you, how would you summarize an approach? Suppose if I have a child within 6 months or 1 year of age, and what would be the stepwise approach as to now?
Yeah, so
Okay, what all differentials could possibly fit in this condition for?
So we have found
the
that
standard question.
Yeah. So basically, if it's a very early presentation, we usually don't think of hereditary spherocytosis. They don't present very early. It's usually autosomal dominant, majority of the cases, and they will have a later kind of presentation. With hereditary spherocytosis, if it is autosomal recessive, they can be fairly severe, and usually they present by 3 to 4 years of age, not in the neonatal. The majority of the cases will give you history of neonatal jaundice, but after that the child will kind of recover. In our experience, we found that cases of pyruvate kinase deficiency, they can behave in a very varied fashion, from the extreme early presentation to late presentation. All kind of situation can be there, and splenectomy are very good in these conditions, both for hereditary spherocytosis and for pyruvate kinase deficiency. It's pretty good. Then for your the other cases that we have found in neonatal period that they have presented, and with fairly severe, where these cases of GPI deficiency and also hexokinase deficiency. But these are like, GPI is also common. I think from NIH Mumbai, they have found a particular mutation to be there more commonly in some community. But apart from that, there aren't too many cases which are diagnosed GPI. And so they can also have a varied kind of presentation depending on where the mutation is. So the pathogenicity will be dependent on that. So early presentations are usually these kind of conditions, PKLR or your GPI and hexokinase. These are very early presentations. HS, usually they present late, kind of.
Thank you. Any questions?
None. There are no questions on the YouTube.
I think people are totally floored by ma'am's presentation. They'll take some time to, they'll take time to gather up again. And but yes, definitely, ma'am, as you have been presenting the cases, it brings, हमने वो वाला देखा था, and we really never came to know. And seeing macrothrombocytopenia and some component of hemolytic anemia is so frequent, and we really invariably, it goes कि ये ITP जैसा तो है, but why is there anemia also?
Just like,
and if it is not BCG, ICG positive, like saying that these are the cases, we really need to be aware of these entities, to.
So specifically for Mediterranean stomatocytosis, if you look at the clinical phenotypes which are there, they are very varied. The patients can have some autoimmune kind of manifestations. They can also have this infertility kind of problems. They can also have, something which comes on, goes off, that kind of thing, endocrine problems. So there are multiple problems that the patients can have, and that's what kind of it makes it very interesting to see these kind of patients.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please do.
Ma'am, actually, sometimes us and other, there is one common question. majority of the patient, when we do initial workup which we have available, and we are not able to find out the definite cause for the hemolysis or that particular anemia. So if somebody want to refer that case or want to send the samples to you for the further diagnosis, and patient is not able to reach Chandigarh, so how we should reach to you that actually that sample which we have collected or DNA we have extracted, so something we can directly send to your institute, ma'am. So some type
If
of
you
sort of
yeah, if you just take pictures and keep, spirocytes and whatever, the peripheral smear and the reticulocytes, it's important to document those things. And then you can just post a DNA sample. The only issue is that, these are, at the moment, we are just doing when all the reagents are not there all the time. So sometimes, it takes months to actually come to a definitive diagnosis. So that can be frustrating for the person who has sent the case. So we are hoping that, over time we'll be able to do these tests on a more regular kind of a basis. Because this initial work was done as a project kind of a mode, and at the moment we are trying to do so that in once in 2 months at least we are able to put up one panel kind of, and once we get the instrument in the department, hopefully we'll be able to do it, offer it like a more frequent kind of a way.
because if we tell our experience, so after doing whatever possible in our department at our center, uh, almost those who are not typical cases, more than 50% of cases we remain undiagnosed and we don't know. So few patients get agree ki, okay, you can go to the Chandigarh and we write a letter for your name ki, you just go and meet to ma'am and she will take care of you for further workup. But most of the patient is not able to afford that thing, and so they say कि आप हमारा यहीं से ही करा दीजिए. So that is the problem. So that's what I asked. If we do initial workup and see send and keep the DNA sample extracted, and then we send it to you, is it okay?
Yeah, it should be fine. It should be fine. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
So, we still not have any questions, ma'am. Either people are continuing looking at you or they are still floored over entities which you have discussed and elaborated upon. So, Dr. Hadeep, what do you suggest? Should we call this? So we have a
There is a
comment.
question by Dr. Vandana Puri. I've
Yeah,
just posted it
Puri.
on the chat.
Yes, sir. So, Dr. Vandana has asked, and she has commented that it was an excellent talk. She's asking that, ma'am, if the child has spherocytosis but NGS is normal, how to proceed?
Yeah, so that is one of the things you need to do counseling. When you're telling that, we are going to send the sample for targeted NGS, it's possible that you don't get a variant because in about 70% of the cases, you will be able to get a pathogenic variant. In about 30% of cases, you may not get. Now, especially again, if you're thinking that it's an autosomal recessive condition and you get one variant, then also the case is not kind of solved because then you have not found the second mutation, which is there kind of. So it is possible that where you have the mutation, that part has that depth is not very good at that particular region, and you may still miss it. It's possible that the variant is there in the intron, and that could also be a reason for missing. And so it's not like 100% hit that you do the cases and you will get a variant which is there.
So, ma'am, I don't know what she's asking practically. Like, practically, if the child is presenting as an HS, that is how probably the management will go forward. Or is she asking that how to proceed on some investigations?
Yeah, so management would be definitely based on what is the basic diagnosis. Yeah, if it is HS or pyruvate kinase deficiency, then typically you would like to do a splenectomy. But if you see overhydrated stomatocytosis, don't do a splenectomy. So that depends on the condition actually. which is there. Sometimes if the child is very severe, then many times they do a partial splenectomy. In PGI, in many cases they do partial splenectomy because they don't want a complete spleen removal if the child is very small.
Ma'am, just a question in between. I was going through a review article. They were talking about ectocytometry also, because there they had mentioned that the patterns in ectocytometry have been helpful to identify this dehydrated or the overhydrated. So, ma'am, you have any experience in how costly is the equipment and user friendly, or what is the review?
Was actually, that instrument was made by Dr. Narla Mohandas, and he's based in New York, and he is a mechanical engineer actually. And he's got plenty of publications on hereditary spherocytosis. So this particular instrument is not, there is no instrument in India. And so there are very few research centers actually which have this instrument. It shows very typical patterns which are there, but we found out, I think Dr. Prashant had found out that it is not available in India at the moment. There's no center which actually has it. I don't know really the cost of the equipment, how expensive.
Right, ma'am. So, ma'am, we have a comment by Dr. Krishnan. He's written excellent presentation, and besides, he's written, how does PGI lab approach hemolytic anemia reflex testing, or physicians if they have to request the tests? In US, the process of obtaining these tests is not easy because of the cost.
Yeah, so initially we have done these entire analysis as a research mode, where we got a project from DBT and that could sustain. So we have not really charged any of our patients for any of the tests we did. But over time, for the service, actually, we will have to charge patients, I presume. And we have fixed the rates and all. So at the moment, I think it's like for targeted NGS, it is 10,000 rupees. But in PGI, if the patient is poor free, then we don't charge anything anyways. So there is the tests are all free for patients who are poor, so below poverty line, so called. But otherwise, and the other tests are not very expensive, like flow cytometry and incubated osmotic fragility tests, and they are not expensive tests to use.
Ma'am, good evening, Kunal here.
Hello, Kunal. Yeah.
Ma'am, when we have an elderly presenting with a hemolytic picture, say 40, 50, 60, we are typically looking at secondary causes for the hemolysis, especially in the elderly. Should we still suspect any enzymopathy or a membrane disorder presenting so late in age? Are there instances you see that?
So usually for these hereditary factors, you will get a history that there was episodic kind of jaundice. If you see that, this is the first presentation, then the chances of acquired is definitely higher. But if they give you a long-standing history that, fever, and then there was a hemolytic episode which was there, so then you have to suspect that possibly this is a hereditary. So we know typically spherocytosis can present very late.
Late, yes, ma'am.
And usually the first case will be late, but then once the diagnosis is made, then the other members of the family, they will be diagnosed because of reflex testing kind of in that family. Early diagnosis will be there.
We sometimes come across cases where we're seeing elliptocytes. We really don't know whether that elliptocytes is the cause of the anemia, and these are elderly, and we are wondering whether it is part of some anemic picture per se, or it is truly elliptocytosis. And then again, because of cost constraint, do we really ask this patient to test them or no? That was where I was actually coming from with elliptocytes.
Elliptocytes, the commonest cause of elliptocytosis will still remain iron deficiency anemia.
Correct.
So if you see elliptocytes and then see retic to be increased, that's the time that you suspect. So the first case we diagnosed here was actually a case of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A bone marrow was done. And on the peripheral smear, I noticed that there were a lot of elliptocytes which were there. When we took the history, we found that this patient had some spleen which was increased, and there was some reticulocytosis and some jaundice there. So many times, they are they're not very severe cases.
Mm-hmm.
They not present actually to the doctor.
Doctor.
And many times actually they present with very mild hyperbilirubinemia. So very typically, what whenever the cases come to us for even Gilbert syndrome and all, we get a lot of samples actually from the clinical side for Gilbert's syndrome testing. And there we anyway do all cases, we do HPLC, and we pick up cases of HS from there,
Okay.
because yeah, the when you look at the HPLC and you find that your P2 peak is low, then this is actually your HbA1c. If you
Okay.
find that to be low, then you need to think that this might be a hemolytic anemia. Look at the peripheral smear, look at the reticulocyte count, because this is what we look at. HbA1c is actually glycosylated hemoglobin, and that is the last 3 months, right?
Yeah.
If hemolysis is going on, this P2 peak will be falsely low.
Ma'am,
So-
less than 4.5 is what you take?
No, in cases of hemolytic anemia, usually it's in the range of 2.5%.
Okay. Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, I've seen cases of even with 1.5% P2 peaks.
Mhm.
So when I look at that, then I say, okay, let's have a look at the peripheral smear, look at the retic count and all. Fortunately, when we are doing the THAL reporting, at that time, we have all the data with us. We have the red cell indices, we have the retic count and everything. So it's easier to kind of make an impression and then advise the further tests.
Definitely adds value. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really a good piece of information to look at the P2 peak. I really didn't know that. ये आपने पढ़ाया नहीं जब मैं पढ़ रही थी आपके पास?
मेरे को भी नहीं आता था. I'm also learning along with the time.
Along the way.
Yes, right. So now I'll start also looking at it because the kind of picture he said कि not 40, 50, 60, but yes, definitely 20, 30 या 15 to 30 के बीच में हम लोग के पास इस तरह के chronic hemolytic occasional jaundice usually सबसे पहला THAL intermedia kind of a thing comes to the mind. So, but yes, I don't know. As you have said, even at an older age, you can sometimes get HS. So maybe I think we first push AIHA and all that before we actually start working up for. Thank you so much, ma'am. There's so much to learn always from you. It was a wonderful session, and Dr. Vandana has thanked you for answering all her queries. And now, Dr. Nadeem, what do you say?
Thank you so much. Let's close. Well, excellent presentation.
Right. Thank you so much. And good night, everyone.
Sometimes you have to go to the upper cafe to learn also.
Yes, very true.
So, do we have a round of tea after this?
Yeah, sure,
Now
why
we
not?
just
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you so much, ma'am. It
Thank
was a
you.
pleasure
Thank
to
you.
listen from you.